The microphone was already hot when Richard Whitmore looked at his son-in-law and said, loud enough for every soul in that ballroom to hear, "This man has been trying to destroy our family, and tonight, he's going to admit it." 300 guests went still, champagne flutes suspended halfway to mouths, conversations severed mid-sentence. The chandelier above the Whitmore estate threw its light across silk gowns, tailored suits, and the faces of Connecticut's most powerful families, all of them now watching Ethan Cole. Ethan was standing at the edge of the stage, not trembling, not scanning the room for help that wasn't coming, just standing there, hands loose at his sides, watching Richard with the kind of quiet that isn't peace. It's something colder, something that already knows how this ends. That calm should have terrified every person in that room. It didn't, because the room had already decided who he was, Vanessa Whitmore's charity case husband, the archivist who spent his days in other people's dead files and came out with delusions. Richard extended one arm toward the stage like he was making a formal presentation. "Ethan, come up here." And Ethan walked up, slowly, without one word of protest. Nobody thought to ask why. The event was Richard's idea, the way everything in the Whitmore family was Richard's idea. The occasion? The 40th anniversary of his marriage to Margaret, celebrated 2 years after her death, which he framed, somehow, as an act of love. A tribute. A legacy evening. He'd printed her face on the centerpieces, commissioned a string quartet to play her favorite pieces, worn the same watch she'd given him on their first anniversary, and made sure 3 separate people noticed it. Richard Whitmore knew exactly how grief was supposed to look. He wore it perfectly. Ethan Cole had arrived in this marriage from a world Richard found quietly humiliating. No inherited connections, no family name that opened rooms, no legacy of anything except competence. He was a university archivist, a man who spent his days cataloging other people's histories, locating the documents everyone else had decided no longer mattered. He had met Vanessa at a gallery opening and loved her before he fully understood what loving her would eventually cost. 6 years later, the cost looked like this: invisibility. Richard never addressed him directly at family dinners if he could address Vanessa instead. His name wasn't on the seating chart at the last Whitmore charity event. They'd written Vanessa's guest. When he mentioned it, she said her father was old-fashioned. She said it the way people say things when they've run out of better explanations and don't want to find one. He had stayed, because of Vanessa. And because, 14 months ago, while sorting through a box of Margaret's belongings that Vanessa had asked him to catalog, he was the archivist after all, it made sense, he had found something that made leaving impossible until he understood it completely. He hadn't told a single person what it was. Tonight, 300 people were going to find out at the same moment. 90 minutes before the gala, Ethan placed a small Bluetooth speaker near the base of the stage podium. He told the venue technician it was for ambient cocktail hour sound. The technician didn't question it. Why would he? Ethan was the son-in-law. He belonged here. It was the only time that assumption had ever worked in Ethan's favor. Vanessa had noticed something in him that afternoon, a stillness she mistook for resignation. She'd asked twice if he was all right. He'd said yes, zipped up her dress, kissed her cheek. She told herself he'd finally made peace with it, her father, the invisibility, the annual performance of being an outsider in an insider family. She felt something loosen with relief in her chest. She had been reading him wrong for 6 months. There was also Gerald Fenn, seated at the head table beside Richard's 2 brothers. Fenn was Margaret's estate attorney, not Richard's. His presence at a private family tribute had no obvious explanation unless someone had specifically invited him, and that someone had not been Vanessa. When Ethan walked past Fenn at the coat check, the older man's eyes found him across the marble floor. Not hostility, something worse. The look of a man who has been sitting on the wrong side of something for a very long time and has spent all evening praying it doesn't reach him tonight. Ethan held the look for exactly 1 second, then moved on. Somewhere between the coat check and the ballroom, he turned his phone to its lowest brightness and sent one text to a number saved under no name. "It's starting." "Most of you know what this family has been through," Richard began, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who has given 1,000 speeches and never once lost a room. "We lost Margaret. We lost the woman who was the center of all of this. And grief, real grief, it does things to people." He paused. The room leaned in. They always did. "It makes some people bitter. It makes some people desperate. It makes some people look for someone to blame. Because the truth, that we simply lost her, that good people die and there's no one responsible, is too unbearable to accept." He turned to face Ethan. The turn was theatrical, rehearsed, the pivot of a man who had been looking forward to this moment. "My son-in-law told my daughter 6 months ago that I killed her mother." The silence was total. Then the murmuring. Sharp, immediate, the sound of a match striking. Heads turned. A gray-haired man at the third table, one of Richard's business partners, shook his head slowly with the visible disgust of someone who'd been waiting for permission to perform it. A woman across from him whispered behind her hand, and her companion covered a smirk. Near the back, a cluster of Whitmore cousins went rigid with the specific delight people feel when a family black sheep is finally slaughtered in public. Vanessa did not look up. She sat at the family table, hands folded in her lap, staring at the centerpiece, her mother's face on the centerpiece. And she did not look at her husband, not once. "He convinced himself," Richard continued, pacing the stage now, "that something was wrong with Margaret's estate, something wrong with her death. He went through her private belongings, boxes Vanessa trusted him to handle respectfully, and built a fantasy from grief and paranoia. He made my daughter's worst year even worse. He made her doubt her family when she needed us most." The gray-haired man started clapping, slowly, like an invitation. Others joined, the way people join things when someone powerful is watching and they want him to register which side they're on. Richard raised a hand to quiet them. Humble, generous, completely in control. "I'm not here for applause. I'm here because this family deserves peace." He looked at Ethan. "So I'm asking him, in front of every person who matters to us, to stand at this microphone and say he was wrong. Say he's sorry. Let this family heal." Then something happened that no one in the room expected. Ethan smiled. Not warmly, not bitterly, the barely visible expression of a man who has spent a very long time traveling toward a specific moment and has finally arrived. He stepped to the microphone. "Before I say anything," Ethan said, "I'd like to give someone else the chance to speak. Someone who couldn't be here tonight." Richard's expression didn't collapse. It froze. The way a face freezes when a very controlled person suddenly cannot locate the next move. Her name was Margaret Whitmore. The sound that moved through the room wasn't quite a gasp, something more physical. A collective intake, 300 people going cold at the same instant. And then the ballroom speakers. The same speakers that had been playing the string quartet's anniversary medley all evening, fed through the auxiliary input Ethan's device had been quietly connected to for 2 hours, played a woman's voice. Warm, slightly husky, unmistakable to every person in that room who had held her hand at her daughter's wedding, who had sat at her Christmas table for 3 decades of dinners and galas and New Year's midnights. Margaret Whitmore, speaking from the dead. "If something happens to me before I can get to Gerald, I want there to be a record. I'm making this the 14th of March. 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days before she died. The gray-haired man who had started the applause still had his hands slightly raised, like he'd forgotten to put them down. Richard gave me documents to sign last month. I know what an asset transfer is. I've been married to this man for 38 years. I was not born not knowing things, whatever he seems to believe. Richard moved toward the microphone. Ethan didn't step aside. He wants me to sign my personal inheritance, not our joint estate, what my father left specifically to me, into a trust structure he controls entirely. Not for Vanessa, not for our grandchildren, for him. When I said I wanted to speak to Gerald privately, he told me Gerald was already aligned with the decision. At the head table, Gerald Fenn had both hands gripping the edge of his chair. I don't know what aligned means in this context. I'm hoping it means something reasonable, but I'm making this recording because something feels wrong. Something has felt wrong for months, and I need someone to know that Margaret Whitmore, in full possession of her mind, has not signed anything, and is not sure she will. Then, quieter, as if she'd nearly turned it off but hadn't quite. I'm afraid of my husband. I don't know what to do with that. The recording ended. In 35 years of Whitmore events, no one in that ballroom had experienced silence like what followed. Not during the eulogies. Not even the night they announced she was gone. Richard grabbed the microphone. His voice was still controlled, but something was working behind his face. Shifting, urgent, like a man throwing his weight against a door while something pushes through from the other side. That recording. Margaret was under severe stress. Her sister was dying. We'd had an argument, a normal marital disagreement, and she was frightened in a way that context would completely... Gerald. Ethan said it once, quietly. The way you say a name to someone who has been pretending to sleep. Gerald Fenn set down his champagne glass without drinking from it. His face had gone the color of old paper. Paul Whitmore, Richard's older brother, the one who'd arrived early and spent 40 minutes in a closed room with Richard before any guest appeared, stood from the head table and gripped Richard's arm. He said something close to his ear. Richard pulled away. Paul said it again, harder, his jaw tight. 2 tables back, a woman who had attended every Whitmore event for 20 years turned to her husband and said, at a volume she thought was private, I always thought something was strange about how fast it happened. Her husband said nothing, but he didn't disagree. Vanessa had finally looked up. She was standing at the family table, both hands pressed flat on the tablecloth, staring at Ethan the way you stare at something you've been seeing wrong for a very long time. Not grief, not anger, recognition. The slow, nauseating arrival of understanding. She had called him paranoid. She had sat across from him in their bedroom 6 months ago and said she thought he needed help. She had chosen her father's word over her husband's, because her father had never, in her entire life, appeared to be anything other than the most powerful and reliable thing she knew. She was now calculating what that choice had cost, and who she had handed it to. Richard's business attorney, Sandra, who handled the living empire rather than the dead woman's estate, crossed the room in long, urgent strides and spoke directly into Richard's ear. Whatever she said drained the last performance from his face. He reached for the microphone anyway. What Ethan is doing here tonight, weaponizing a grieving woman's private fears in front of her family and friends, is perhaps the most revealing thing about his character. There's more, Ethan said. The room didn't need asking to go quiet. It already was. I'm an archivist, Ethan said. I don't stop at the first document. The recording was not where it began. It was what helped Ethan understand the beginning, which was a sealed, handwritten letter he'd found beneath a false bottom in a box of Margaret's belongings, addressed to Gerald Fenn, never sent. Written 4 days before she fell ill for the last time. She didn't use legal language. She used the language of a woman who had spent 38 years learning to decode her husband's silences. She described a secondary will, drafted without her knowledge, in her name, redirecting her personal inheritance to a holding company she could not identify. She described an overheard conversation between Richard and Paul, in which Paul had said, after she's gone, in a tone that made her set down her teacup and stand very still in the hallway for a long time afterward. She wrote, I feel like a problem being managed. Ethan had taken the letter to Gerald Fenn because Gerald was the man Margaret had trusted. Because he had wanted, for Vanessa's sake, to believe this could be handled quietly. Gerald asked for time. Time became silence. Silence became, around month 4, the slow realization that Gerald had told Richard exactly what Ethan had found. And then Richard had moved. Get ahead of it. Get Ethan in front of witnesses. Make him the paranoid outsider before he could become the man who found the truth. It was a sharp move. Richard Whitmore made sharp moves. What he couldn't have accounted for, Ethan had spent 14 months making copies of everything. What he didn't know, 48 hours before the gala, Ethan had submitted a complete file to the state attorney general. What he had fundamentally misread, the way powerful men always misread quiet ones, was that patience is not the same as passivity. I have one question for Gerald, Ethan said. Gerald Fenn stared at the tablecloth. Did Richard call you in November and ask you to halt the estate verification? Silence. Did you contact Richard after I brought you that letter? Paul Whitmore stood. He walked fast. Too fast. The gait of a man who has decided escape matters more than appearances now. A woman near the aisle stepped back instinctively to let him pass and then stood in place, unclear why she'd moved. Something in the way he was traveling, like flight. He didn't reach the door. The two men who'd spent the evening quietly near the back, the ones with lanyards that looked like press credentials, stepped forward. They didn't touch him. They simply stood in the way. Paul stopped. Richard's voice cracked for the first time, a sound like something structural giving. This is a setup. He planned this. Vanessa, look at me. This man has been... Margaret's death was ruled cardiac decline, Ethan said. Not loud, completely level. Standard findings. Standard panel. Her medications were logged. Nothing flagged because nobody requested an extended toxicology screen. The room had stopped processing. Everyone was just receiving now, very still, the way animals go still in the presence of something they don't yet understand. I requested an extended panel, private lab, 6 months ago. A pause with real weight in it. The results have been with the Attorney General since Thursday. Vanessa sat down as if her legs had quietly opted out. Richard Whitmore opened his mouth. For the first time in 40 years of controlled performance, nothing came out. The room broke the way controlled things always break, all at once, from everywhere. Gerald Fenn rose and said, in a voice that couldn't hold steady, I need to speak with Ethan, privately. For anyone who had ever watched a guilty man navigate a public moment, it landed like a signed statement. Sandra gripped Richard's elbow and pulled him close, and whatever she said made him close his eyes for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds in front of 300 witnesses. The gray-haired man who had shaken his head and started the sympathetic clapping was now locked in a furious, low-whispered exchange with his wife. She had her hand on her clutch. He had the expression of a man rapidly reassessing his public associations. Near the back, a woman Ethan had never met, someone's aunt, someone's old friend, said, at a volume that carried, I knew something was wrong. I knew it at the funeral. He didn't cry once. Richard looked at Ethan across the stage. He looked at him the way a person looks at someone when they finally, completely understand that they have not merely lost a battle, they have lost everything that came after it. And then Richard Whitmore, who had built companies from leverage, absorbed scandals with a smile, sat across from men who tried to ruin him and sent them home unsatisfied, sat down on the edge of the stage, both hands over his face. In front of 300 witnesses. Not a calculation, not a performance, just a man whose story had finally caught up with him in public, in his own ballroom, surrounded by his own people. It was the only genuine moment Ethan had ever witnessed from him, and somehow, that made it the worst thing in the room. The gala ended without dinner. The string quartet packed in silence. Guests left in clusters, speaking carefully, in the deliberate way that means I want to be able to say later that I always suspected. Nobody touched the champagne tower. Margaret's face remained on every centerpiece as the staff cleared around them. Vanessa found Ethan on the stone terrace. Cold air, dark grounds, the faint sound of car doors closing as the last guest disappeared. She stood beside him for a long time without speaking. Did you know? He finally asked. Not as accusation, just a question he needed answered. "No." "Are you sure?" The pause before she said yes was half a second longer than it should have been. Ethan noticed. He didn't say so. "I called you paranoid," she said. "You did." "I told my father what you'd found." Her voice had gone completely flat. "I told him you were going through Mom's things and getting... I said you were struggling. He said he'd handle it. I didn't ask what that meant." Ethan looked at the dark grounds. "He said he'd handle it," she repeated, as if she were hearing the words for the first time, what they actually meant, who she had handed them to. She hadn't known what Richard had done, but she had told him what Ethan had found. She had given her father a 6-month head start and told herself it wasn't her responsibility to ask questions. She had chosen comfort. She had chosen the image of a family over the reality of the man she married. She hadn't known, but she had made it possible. Whether that was betrayal or just fear with a familiar face, that was a question she would be living inside for a very long time. There is no clean verdict. That's what makes this story so difficult to walk away from. Ethan was right about everything. He found the truth when no one was looking, protected it when no one believed him, and exposed it when the moment made it irreversible. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He waited until the room had no choice but to hear him. But he also let his wife believe for 6 months that she was married to an unstable man. He let her call him paranoid. He let her side with her father, let her carry the full weight of that mistake in front of 300 people instead of just one. Was that strategy? Or was that punishment dressed as patience? And Vanessa. She didn't know what Richard had done, but she told him what Ethan had found. She handed her husband's evidence to the man using it against him and decided it wasn't her job to ask questions. She chose her father's version of reality over her husband's, because her father had always felt more solid, more certain, more like safety. Is that a betrayal? Or is that just what people do when the truth is heavier than they're willing to carry? And the guests, the ones who clapped, smirked, enjoyed watching a quiet man be dismantled in public, they drove home that night and searched the Whitmore name and told each other they'd always known something was off. They hadn't known anything. Not one of them had thought to ask. 3 weeks later, with the investigation public and Richard's empire cracking at every seam, Ethan returned to the estate to collect their things. The house had been locked pending proceedings. He had clearance because Vanessa still held partial ownership. The two of them had not yet discussed what came next. The conversation kept arriving at the edge of things and stopping there. He walked through Margaret's study. He hadn't planned to. On her desk, undisturbed through all the weeks of chaos, as if no one had thought to look there, sat a photograph in a silver frame. Margaret, young, maybe mid-30s, beside a woman Ethan had never seen before. Dark-haired, her hand on Margaret's arm with the easy familiarity of someone who had known her a very long time. He turned the frame over. Margaret's handwriting. He recognized it by now. She was there for all of it. If something happens to me, she already knows. She's been waiting to be asked. No name. Ethan stood in the study of a woman who had spent the last years of her life building a map out of photographs and voice recordings and letters she never sent. And he understood, with the particular clarity of someone who catalogs hidden things for a living, that everything he had uncovered was not the secret. It was the entrance to the secret. There was a woman out there who had known Margaret Whitmore from before Richard, who had watched all of it unfold from close enough to know what no document would ever contain, who had been waiting for 2 years in silence for someone to finally come and ask the right question. He took the photograph. He sat in his car with it for 11 minutes before he started the engine. He drove, not home, not to his lawyer, not back to the Attorney General's office, somewhere else entirely. He was still an archivist, and the most important collections were always the ones nobody had thought to open yet.